for centuries in trying to bring about peace and reconciliation around the world. And I want to thank all those that have done so much to bring about tonight's event and indeed the work of this institute. Congratulate the Vice-Chancellor and all those in Lancaster University who do so much to bring an outward global-facing approach to research, teaching and learning. This university has many ambassadors, many graduates who've gone on to do incredible things around the world, and I love the way that this university extends out within the county of Lancashire to colleges and other places, and I saw that today when I was in Blackburn. You do have one absolutely brilliant alumni, and I think you should be very proud of your MP, Cat Smith. And I want to thank all the students that have studied and made their contribution to policy and helped create a world arriving for common security and peace. So as I said, it's an enormous privilege for me to be able to deliver this lecture here today. And over the years, these lectures, and indeed lectures like this in other places, create an important space to discuss the issues of peace, security and conflict in our world, and give people who have taken a serious interest in this issue all of their lives some space to expand their views and try and share them with others. So I see predecessors who've given this lecture, Professor Linda Brickman and my old friend, the late great Tony Benn, who also gave that lecture some years ago. My involvement in peace movements and peace activities goes back to my teenage years. I grew up in a country area in the 1950s and 1960s, and remember the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 and the fear there was around at that time. Also, I remember, of course, the opposition to the Vietnam War, which I was very much part of, and membership of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which I joined at that time and have been a member of ever since. I learnt a lot from peace movements, learnt a lot that peace is more than the absence of war. And more recently, the events of 9/11 were a turning point in the attitude of the world towards each other, and a turning point in the sense there was a reactivization of anti-war and peace movements all around the world through the founding in Britain of the Stop the War Coalition, but other organizations of a similar type in other parts of the world. So my involvement from those organizations has led me to peace conferences and activities in many parts of the world, including anti-nuclear conferences in India, as well as addressing big peace rallies in the United States. And my greatest claim to fame was sharing a platform in San Francisco with Bonnie Raitt and other great singers at their huge anti-war movement there. The opposition to war and peace movements in Britain goes back a very long way. It goes back to often religious thinking in the 19th century, and across Europe, the growth of an anti-war movement in the 19th century, culminating in the Hague Conference in 1901, huge opposition to the First World War, and post the First World War, the growth of quite large, mainly pacifist organizations around the world, all of whom have made a contribution to peace ideas and peace thinking. And I think we should never be ashamed to look at those that went before, look at the sacrifices they made, and realize that they struggled to try and end the scourge of war and try and bring about peace in the future. To me, it's an enormous honour to lead the Labour Party, which I have to say, I'm very proud to say, is now the largest political party in Europe with well over 500,000 members. The first leader of the Labour Party, and the last one to wear a beard before me, was Keir Hardie, who not only was a child labourer, a child miner, and became a union official, eventually became a Labour MP, and had an amazingly internationalist outlook in his life. For somebody that had grown up in a very small mining community in Scotland, went on to become an MP, as I said, the leader of our party, and travelled to many parts of the world in pursuit of peace, and put enormous efforts into trying to prevent the First World War taking place by building an international peace movement across Europe to try to bring together a workers' movement that would oppose the war. Initially, it was quite successful, but then the jingoism and the xenophobia took over. That war killed 17 million people and wounded many more, making it amongst the deadliest conflicts in human history. He declared, "Down with the rule of brute force, down with war, up with the peaceful rule of the people." All of history is now in agreement of the underlying causes of the First World War. Imperialism, the desire to conquer colonies, especially in Africa, and to intervene in them, brought the powerful European countries into conflict. Their militarism, their race to acquire arms, the attempt to build up a strong army and navy gave nations the means and the will to go to war. And what started out as a series of interlocking treaties in the Balkans ended up with a conflict in which millions died on the Western Front and other parts of the world. And as the war progressed, more and more troops were sucked in from all over the planet. 100 years on, Hardy's declaration remains true and necessary. And I think we have to realise the understanding of how that war started as much as others in our search for a long-term peace. Peace is where all people on this planet have access to resources to live dignified lives with the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. And I think we have to look at it in the more recent aspects of decisions and reports that have been made in Britain and by the British Parliament. As I said, on the 15th of February 2003, a huge demonstration took place in Britain in opposition to the then proposed invasion of Iraq. 1.5 million people spanning the entire political spectrum and tens of millions of others across the war marched against that war, the biggest demonstration in British history of any sort. There are many lessons that need to be learned from the Iraq War for our country, our government and parliament, as well as my own party. Sir John Chilcot expressed a hope that the key outcome of his inquiry would be the UK would not again embark on a major military interventions without consideration of all of the consequences, including the security of the people in Britain and around the world. However, before the inquiry had been published, Britain was already engaged in war with airstrikes against the so-called Islamic State in Iraq, extending it into Syria. This came in addition to many different military operations being undertaken in Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan. What unites all of those are the shifting terms of the reference to war. I'll give you an example. In Libya, the government told us that the objective of intervention was to protect civilians from attacks by forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi, yet we quickly saw mission creep into regime change. Parliament voted to go to war and to take part in the bombing of Libya, and this September, the All-Party Foreign Affairs Committee examining the intervention and the subsequent collapse of the once prosperous North African state said, and I quote, the state objective of intervention in Libya to protect civilians was not informed by accurate intelligence. Moreover, it was clear that before March 2011 intervention and after it began, that political solutions to the conflict were available and were viable. Political engagement in the first instance might have delivered civilian protection and stabilisation and reform. Given Britain's role in the conflict and subsequent destabilisation of Libya, this country has a particular responsibility in relation to migrants and refugees, an issue which has been exacerbated by the collapse of the Libyan state. In Syria, the majority of MPs did indeed vote in support of airstrikes exclusively against IS, but now our intervention is, and I quote from an MOD statement, a bombing campaign in support of moderate ground forces and to establish a government that will neither be authoritarian or repressive on the one hand, nor Islamist or extreme on the other. There is no doubt that the so-called Islamic State group has imposed a reign of terror on millions in Iraq, Syria and Libya. All that stands for and does is contrary to everything many of us have struggled for over generations. And yet again, Another Foreign Affairs Committee report concludes expanding military action in Syria would compromise its diplomatic capability and capacity to put pressure on the national and international partners to create a political route to solve the problems of IS and to end the civil war. It's clear that the extension of British bombing has not contributed to a comprehensive negotiated political settlement of the Syrian civil war, which is the only way this horrific conflict will be brought to an end. Syria's civil war is the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. Half the country's pre-war population, more than 11 million people, have been killed or forced to flee their homes. With the innocent civilians of Aleppo continuing to suffer and their situation getting more desperate by the day, we need an urgent, proactive and concerted effort by the international community to end violence on all sides, institute and maintain a UN-led ceasefire to enable humanitarian relief to be delivered. Attacks on civilian targets and humanitarian aid convoys are war crimes for which there can never be any excuse, and their perpetrators must be held accountable. The 2003 invasion of Iraq led inevitably to sustained armed resistance, fostered sectarianism and left the country vulnerable to explosions of violent civil conflict, its weak government unable to deal with any of the potential threats. Leading the way to the fall of Mosul in the northern Iraq city to IS, which seemingly shocked regional and Western governments. So there are consequences of every war which need to be thought about before you go there. In Yemen, we see a war which involves a Saudi-led coalition of Sunni Arab states against Iranian-backed Houthi groups. The risk of famine is severe, and the UN believes that more than 14 million people are food insecure, half of them severely so, while nearly 1 in 10 have been driven from their homes. 6,500 people have already been killed. But since the war began, Britain has signed off more than 100 arms licenses. Saudi Arabia is one of our biggest buyers. The reality is that if Britain is not in direct combat in the war, our weapons are. When governments prioritise the lives and welfare, governments must prioritise the lives and welfare of millions of Yemeni people over short-term profits for the arms trade from sales to Gulf Cooperation Council states. The situation is dangerous and desperate, which is why I raised it at Prime Minister's question time yesterday, and we had a special debate on it in Parliament yesterday. Should our focus not be directed towards exercising our diplomatic capacity instead? Overall, we can better resource our Foreign Office to enable UK diplomats to work towards diffusing tensions and improving relations and human rights between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This relationship is the core of what has become a proxy war in Yemen. We're often told the purpose of wars are to preserve national security or to foster democracy. The reality, however, is somewhat different. Let's be clear, the only outcome of any war is death and displacement. We need to redefine what makes us secure in this world. Is what makes us safe really arming our country to the teeth and getting other countries to arm themselves with the weapons that we produce and we sell them? Europe faces the impact of the refugee crisis, fueled by wars across the Middle East and a number of African countries who have to face repeated military interventions by many countries. We should recognise the disproportionate weight this refugee crisis has placed on neighbours, Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, as well as some of the Mediterranean countries of Europe. Beyond the crisis, beyond the refugee crisis, the consequences of war and intervention have been spread by sectarianism, terrorism and instability. The ongoing conflict in Iraq in the past 2.5 years has already resulted in 3.3 million Iraqis having to flee their homes, accounting for nearly 1 in 10 of the population. Over 10 million Iraqis currently require some form of humanitarian assistance. including 3.4 million civilians who are internally displaced, many for the second or third time. Indeed, I've met some of those people in various countries across the Middle East. In September, the UN estimated that there were around 250,000 Libyan refugees, asylum seekers in need of protection or assistance. That is just from Libya. The total for the whole region is far higher. If we accept the primacy and judgment of international law, we cannot accept the current prevailing situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Today, there are some 5 million Palestinian refugees. Nearly one-third of the registered Palestinian refugees, more than 1.5 million individuals, live in 58 recognized Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syrian Arab Republic, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and of course, parts of East Jerusalem. In October 2014, I was one of many in Parliament who voted for Palestinian statehood. In voting for it, I considered I was voting for peace and an assistance towards the peace process. There has to be peace that comes from justice. Peace will not be achieved by the permanent occupation and settlement of Palestinian land. Settlement buildings in occupied territories are illegal under international law. The goal has to be to preserve the viability of the two-state solution to the outcome of this conflict. The international community must be far more proactive in promoting a political settlement, a secure peace, justice and security, both for Palestinians and Israelis. Security of one will never be achieved at the expense of the other. The people of occupied Palestine have had to endure the blanket denial of freedom for nearly 50 years. Quite simply, the occupation must end in order to bring about a peace process. All sides have to adhere to international law with full accountability for those who violate it. That is the principle that should be applied in any conflict zone. In the case of Israel and Palestine, this must include an end to all attacks on civilians, collective punishment, including the humanitarian blockade of Gaza, and complete cessation of all settlement activity. We will continue to work with human rights groups and other organisations that call out human rights abuses, expose attempts to undermine peace and realise freedom. Let's be clear, this should include and must and does include groups in both the Palestinian territories and in Israel. To many in the UK, these events and conflicts and wars, despite our direct involvement in them, often feel very distant. Much of our media does not report very much of what's going on around the world, and most political debate is focused onto domestic issues. But one of the biggest events of recent times to damage our sense of stability, the global banking crash that unleashed the profound economic and political crisis, the most severe since the 1930s. The progressive failure of the neoliberal economic model has ended to many the freedom of a secure home, secure job, productive job that satisfies and enriches life, the security of knowing your loved ones will be well cared for when they get old or fall sick, the security of knowing your children, nieces or nephews will attend a good school. It's that sense of insecurity that's now grown in this country because of the economic crash, and that is the necessity of a political alternative to austerity that I hope the Labour Party is now offering to everyone in this country. But this lecture is about peace and is about the concepts of security. There is a real security gap in the world today. Millions of people in regions in the Middle East, East and Central Africa or Central Asia, where new wars are taking place, live in daily fear of violence. Moreover, new wars are increasingly intertwined with other global risks, including vulnerability to natural disasters, scarcity of resources, and poverty. Many wars are linked to the search for natural resources, including oil. We must face up to the challenge of socio-economic marginalisation and of climate change. The world economy is not delivering fairness for the majority of people, leading to increased feelings of marginalisation and insecurity. The facts of climate change can no longer be ignored. We can expect more natural disasters and the need to effectively divert our resources and develop expertise to deal with this, and use our development assistance to support countries in the global south to do the same. We must tackle the issue of environmental refugees, people either driven off their land because of desertification or those created by a modern form of land grabbing, the purchase of long-term lease of vast tracts of land from mostly poor developing countries by wealthier, food-insecure nations, as well as private entities to produce food for export. This is happening in East Africa, it's happening in other parts of the world. Wealthy countries buying up land, they protect for themselves to grow food to send back home. In the long term, this will create the most grotesque forms of insecurity as local people are prevented from farming their own land to produce food for themselves. It's raised deep concerns over food security and agricultural development. So Priti Patel's idea, which she shared with us a couple of days ago, of diverting Department of International Development funds into other functions is not the right approach at all. If we're serious about international development, it has to be international development for the good of all people, not just the idea that one would promote British self-commercial interests as a result of it. That was the guiding force that set up the Ministry of Overseas Development in 1964 by the then Labour government. Closer to home, we live in difficult times. The rise in divisive politics of xenophobia and hate are a real threat to the human security of many migrants and refugees all over Europe who've built homes and made contributions to the places and the communities where they now live. Conventional concepts of peace and security, much of our thinking has been drawn from the very dominant experience of the horrors of World War II and based on the use of military force. They do not reduce that insecurity, instead they often make it worse. This prism cannot help us to answer these common challenges to peace that I've just outlined. We are yet to learn that peace can never be achieved by the insecurity of the other. Our peace is not achieved by creating greater injustice or insecurity for other people. The task for politicians is to propose real solutions to the most important issues of peace facing humanity. In order to respond to the complexity and interrelatedness of both old and new threats to peace, there must be a move beyond traditional notions of security that focus on external military aggression alone. Serious as that is, you have to focus on other issues as well. We need to build a consensus that acknowledges the linkages and interdependencies between development, human rights, and national security. A traditional security policy based on defence of borders and containment of threats. This has often seen our support for regimes that are frankly authoritarian and we don't like, including military intervention or the maintenance of bases, regardless of the consequences for people living in the countries in question. We have to have some serious rethinking on that. This approach, based on a narrow definition of national interest, is no longer realistic in a world characterized by global interconnectedness. Insecurity experienced by people living beyond our perceived borders has a tendency to spread. Moreover, it's very difficult to sustain closed societies in an era of globalization. Britain has a responsibility to promote a more peaceful world, to address the underlying causes of conflict and insecurity, to combat the proliferation of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and to contribute to international peacekeeping operations. The security of the lives of human beings outside our own borders cannot be just perceived as an issue someone else will deal with. The security of people outside our immediate borders impacts on our own peace. Given the failures of the last few decades, we need a fundamental rethink on security. That's why we're promoting open debate within our own party on the kind of foreign policy and the kind of security concepts we develop for the future to bring about real security. We need to rebalance our foreign policy pillars of defence, development and diplomacy. What history tells us, most wars and conflicts are brought to an end by political and diplomatic solutions. Britain's diplomatic capacity is important for responding to the many challenges to peace and stability. Our policy will be to expand and properly fund Britain's diplomatic services with an emphasis on developing high-quality expertise in the practice of mediation, conflict resolution and post-conflict peace building. We must be at the heart of the agenda of internationalism and cooperation that effectively responds to the shared challenges to peace to all of humanity. We must pursue the agenda of women's economic empowerment as a key to stable, sustainable development. We must also not forget the struggle against international tax evasion that takes money out of the pockets of the world's very poorest and puts them into luxury tax havens around the world. Defence should not be just about creating peace. It should also be about our international commitments. Leaving the European Union should not make us look inwards, but should make us look outwards, both to Europe and the rest of the world. We don't want to become an island cut off and looking only at ourselves. We are still a country with a global outlook and with global obligations. I want us to develop a foreign policy and an international policy that not only acknowledges our participation in the United Nations and our signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. I want to put the promotion of human rights and justice as absolutely central to what we do and what we believe in as a country. We need to use our role in international security bodies, such as NATO alliance, to diffuse tensions rather than exacerbate them. And there are serious tensions developing in Eastern and Central Europe at the present time. NATO's eastward expansion into the former Soviet Union has not reduced tensions or delivered greater security any more than Russian militarization on the border may have done so, nor have deployments of troops to the borders by both parties made anything safer. What's needed instead is a policy that puts negotiation and genuine collective security across the whole of Europe first, instead of what can look like increasingly bellicose and very dangerous saber rattling. This is a time, surely, for diplomacy to take over and be preeminent in this crucial period. We will continue to develop our international policy based on human dignity and humanitarian law. Labour will pursue an active nuclear disarmament strategy, leading to talks with other nuclear weapon states. We have a responsibility under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to do so proactively and in good faith, just as much as I want us also to be participating in the ban treaty process that the UN has now set up to try and bring about a global ban on all nuclear weapons. Nuclear disarmament is something that we should all strive for with the greatest endeavour we can muster, because the existence of nuclear weapons clearly is a danger to the whole planet. Therefore, I've created the position of Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament, and I'm very pleased that my good friend Fabian Hamilton, one of the Leeds MPs, has taken that position on, and he'll welcome the opportunity to work with it and institute this peace process going forward. We will pursue the reconfiguration of British conventional forces to be more versatile, with the potential for greater involvement in rapid stabilisation, disaster relief, UN peacekeeping and conflict resolution. Britain can play a leading role in increasing the UN's capacity to keep peace and protect lives and promote a fairer international division of labour for peace operations. We have to stop undermining the UN with our current approaches that we suggest we can pick and choose the international obligations and laws we like and we adhere to. To this end, a Labour government will introduce legislation in Britain for a comprehensive War Powers Act, which will include all types of warfare and account for mission escalation. This law has been proposed many times before. Most countries have it, and whilst Parliament does now vote, usually before troops are deployed, there is still no requirement on a government to do so. I think the power of Parliament should be there to control whether or not this country gets involved in international conflict or not. Security is not bombs, guns, and arms. We will have peace when economic security, freedom from poverty and unemployment is there. We will have peace when we have food security, freedom from hunger and from famine. We will have peace when we have health security, freedom from unsafe food, malnutrition and access to basic health care. We will have peace when we can guarantee our children and their children a world free from environmental degradation, resource depletion, natural disasters and pollution. That requires an education endeavour to bring up our children understanding the need for sustainability on this planet, understanding the finiteness of the natural resources of the planet. Peace is also freedom from the personal insecurity of physical violence, domestic violence, child labour and terrorism. We will have peace when we can ensure community security and eliminate interethnic, religious and other identity-based tensions. We'll have security when humanity can deliver the political security and freedom from political repression and human rights abuses. These are concerns shared by all of humanity. Peace should not be seen as a sort of remote pipe dream that people only think about in university or whatever else. It has to be something that is seen as desirable and deliverable, and governments should be working towards it. But it cannot be achieved without dealing with the root causes of security and injustice, as I've tried to outline in this talk. The injustice of food insecurity, the injustice of poverty, the injustice of people that are forced to flee from a dangerous situation to try and gain safety somewhere else and end up dying in the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea trying to achieve a place of safety. So we must remain committed to make this world a safer place, a place of shared prosperity where human rights and human dignity are the centre of our thinking and our actions. If we're united on this, we can achieve a great deal. I thought quite a lot before coming to speak here tonight because I've spent my life working for peace and I want my party to be in government and I want my party to be in government to help deliver a more peaceful, safer and more sustainable world. That means challenging a lot of concepts. It also means recognising that we have to bring about a sense of global justice if we're to end the insecurities that exist around the world. One war after another does not make the world a safer place. It actually ends up making it an infinitely more dangerous place. There are many people in many parts of the world who've done enormous things to try and bring about peace within their own societies. They have stood up in the face of baying mobs. They've stood up in order to try and bring about a greater rationality in what they do. The Liberian peace activist, Lema Roberta Gbowee, was awarded the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize for her non-violent struggle for the safety of women and for women's rights to full participation in peace-building work. So we don't have to wait for another Gandhi, another Martin Luther King, another Nelson Mandela. It's in our own hearts and our own mind how we can change things across the world. It's in our own hearts and our own minds how we can think of the horrors of conflict, of the millions that have died in all the wars down all the centuries, and how we can ensure that the world's institutions do protect people from wars in the future. And we play our part we play our part as a wealthy, industrialized nation to try to help to bring about that greater peace and justice around the world. In a sense, we all have a duty and all have a role to do that. And this institution here at Lancaster University helps people to think how that can be achieved, as do many others in many other parts of the world. Peace is something that we all should not just aspire to, but work for and dedicate our lives to try to achieve, so that succeeding generations don't suffer the scourges of war that so many previous generations have, and so many people around the world are still suffering from today. Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight.
I've been thinking whilst I've been sat here that the first time I sat in this lecture theatre was in 2003 as a first-year student, which is quite a pertinent year given the content of the talk we've just heard from Jeremy Corbyn. As a first-year sociology student, I sat here and tried to make sense of the world around me. I wasn't a member of the Labour Party then, but when I joined the Labour Party a year or so later, it was because of politicians like Jeremy Corbyn and like Tony Benn, who was just mentioned, who gave me the confidence that I could join the Labour Party and work with people who shared my view that we should be working towards peace. Obviously, back then, the lecture theatre wasn't quite so full as it is tonight because the university scheduled a first-year lecture at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning. And for those of you that are too young to remember the Carlton nightclub in Morecambe, that's a real big disincentive to get into a 9 o'clock lecture on a Thursday morning. I would like to thank Jeremy for his wonderful speech, which I think highlights the wide-ranging and often overlooked factors we need to consider when pursuing our desire for peace. But sadly, as Jeremy highlighted, we are currently seeing conflict in all too many areas of the world, and here in the UK, and even here in Lancashire. It saddened me that a few weeks ago we learnt of a Polish man in Lancaster who was assaulted on the canal, and the police didn't rule out that it was because he was speaking in his native language. So it's clear that increases in racism and xenophobia, whilst a national phenomenon, are not isolated from our beautiful and diverse city. And this week, I attended a public hearing about the new proposed constituency boundaries, and I was upset to hear some contributors saying that Morecambians and Lancastrians cannot live side by side in the same constituency. One contribution even said that they would beat each other up, and I thought that was a really sad thing to have said, but I don't believe that it is the case, and I do believe that both locally, nationally and globally we can live side by side. As the MP for Lancaster and Fleetwood, I'm particularly interested in what we can do locally to challenge this and build a culture of peace. Here in Lancaster, there is much in our past that we can look to for inspiration. And Jeremy rightly paid tribute to Sir Lewis Fry Richardson, whose commitment to this institution, whose commitment to peace this institution honours. We can also be inspired by this university's first Vice-Chancellor, Charles Carter, who was also a Quaker and a pacifist. He was so committed to peace that he served time in prison whilst refusing to be conscripted into the army. And we can celebrate our city's fair trade status, which helps to support and sustain development worldwide and gives families across the globe, which Jeremy referred to, a way to free from poverty and hunger. And we should try and build on our university's tradition of peace and our city's humanitarian achievements when facing the challenges of the future. It isn't difficult to see how the problems facing the world will affect us locally, be it climate change, the refugee crisis, or economic insecurity. We need to ensure that we offer solutions that bring people together and make them more secure, rather than sowing division and fear. And the good news is that many of our communities are already doing this. I've been overwhelmed as a local MP and frankly delighted about the hundreds of emails that I receive from constituents urging me to speak up in Parliament on behalf of refugees. They tell me to reject the scaremongering and demand the government do more to reunite families and provide homes to vulnerable children. And I've been inspired by those across Lancashire who have stepped up and peacefully campaigned against plans to frack in our county. Plans that will harm both the local environment and our planet as a whole. I have welcomed the support that I've received for my campaign locally to provide funds for flood defences so that we don't see a repeat of the appalling scenes of last December in Storm Desmond. And I am proud that here in Lancaster, our radical and peaceful traditions are alive and well. And I look forward to working with everyone here to ensure that they remain so into the future. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both of you for two very thought-provoking and fascinating speeches that are very much in the sentiment of the Richardson Institute as an organisation. So on behalf of the Institute, thank you very much for coming and for sharing these words. I was pleased to hear that the concepts that were discussed were discussed and challenged in a way that requires much broader engagement. But of course, if we accept this, there are some serious consequences. Certainly the university has a role to play in broadening these concepts, and we all have a role to play here as well in a university lecture theatre. But if we accept this as well, then we have to accept that everybody has a role to play. Everybody has to become involved in challenging these concepts, challenging injustice and structural violence wherever we see it. And I think that's one of the values that the Richardson Institute can bring to Lancaster and to the broader community. And so on that note, I'd like to hand you back to Roger very quickly.
I simply want to say that 2 weeks tomorrow, that's on Remembrance Day, the 11th of November, we do have a day conference here put on by the Richardson Institute looking at infrastructures for peace within Morecambe Bay. And if you look at the piece of paper that is either in front of you or now in your bag or on the floor, under your feet, all the details are there. And we want to encourage as many people as possible to come. Well aware that some of us present are either lecturers or students, or you have full-time work programs. But if you can find your way to get to at least some of the day, we would really appreciate it. We would love to see you there. I also want to very quickly mention that the other thing that the Richardson Institute provides is the opportunity for those who want to think through what a culture of peace looks like within their own workday lives. We have a certificate of accreditation in political theology for peace that is particularly designed for folk who are in full-time occupation but would like to look in a postgraduate way at the issues of peace. And we're recruiting right now for this coming Lent term's course. Only costs you £721. You get a postgraduate certificate of accreditation in political theology. And if you're interested in that, if you look at the email address that Jim Paris has got there, you can let him know you're interested and he'll tell the department. So thank you very, very much. We are very encouraged that you're all here, and particularly, once again, thank you, Jeremy Corbyn, thank you, Kat Smith, thank you so much.